We're also identifying shocking levels of incompetence and probable fraud in the Social Security program.
At 1:58 a.m., a federal monitoring system flagged a transaction that should have disappeared unnoticed. It wasn't large enough to trigger immediate concern. It wasn't connected to any active investigation. And under normal circumstances, it would have passed through the system like millions of other automated transfers processed every single week. But the system did not flag the amount. It flagged the structure. The routing sequence matched a financial pattern investigators had archived nearly 18 months earlier during a failed corruption investigation that abruptly went cold. At the time, analysts believed they were looking at a hidden laundering corridor buried somewhere inside legitimate government infrastructure. But the evidence disappeared before they could identify the source. No suspects. No confirmed access point. No arrests. Eventually the case was sealed and buried inside an inactive federal archive. Until this transfer brought it back. When analysts reopened the old records, the match was exact. Same timing intervals. Same fragmented transfer behavior. Same sequencing designed to stay below federal reporting thresholds. But there was one major difference. The movement was cleaner now. Faster. More refined. Whoever built the system had improved it after the first investigation failed. Which meant the operation had never stopped. It had evolved. The case was quietly reopened. No press conference. No federal announcement. No public awareness. Just a small internal review team assigned to determine whether the pattern represented isolated fraud. Or something much larger hiding beneath the system itself. At first investigators focused on the destination of the money. But the funds never stayed in one place long enough to trace. Accounts opened and closed rapidly. Transfers split into smaller fragments before reappearing elsewhere. Digital identities surfaced briefly before disappearing again. Everything inside the structure kept moving. Constantly rotating. Constantly adapting. Always staying ahead of automated detection systems. That was when investigators changed strategy. Instead of asking where the money ended, they started asking how it moved. And that changed everything. Because this network was not designed around storage. It was designed around flow. Continuous motion across accounts, identities, and systems that never remained stable long enough to expose the larger structure. Within days, analysts uncovered dozens of connected shell entities tied to consulting firms, administrative contractors, and back-end processing vendors spread across multiple states. Individually, every company looked legitimate. Federal registrations were active. Licenses were clean. Tax filings matched operational records. But together, the companies formed something far more dangerous. A hidden financial corridor operating quietly beneath trusted government systems. And every layer of that corridor pointed toward one central location. Texas. Weeks passed. The transfers continued. Small amounts. Consistent timing. Perfectly structured movement. Nothing large enough to trigger emergency intervention. But collectively, the scale kept growing. Then investigators discovered something unexpected. A name. At first it appeared insignificant. Just another administrative systems contractor attached to internal authorization files. But when analysts cross-referenced archived records, the same name surfaced repeatedly. Inside approval logs. Verification overrides. Network authorizations. Internal routing permissions. That was the moment the investigation paused. Because repetition at that level is never accidental. It is structural. The individual was not directly linked to the transfers themselves. He was linked to the systems approving them. And those systems led directly into a hidden layer of federal processing infrastructure operating outside standard oversight visibility. At that point, investigators realized this was no longer isolated financial fraud. This was system-level corruption. Someone with authorized access was quietly manipulating the infrastructure itself. And if agents moved too early, the entire structure could disappear before they identified how deep it actually went. So they waited. They watched. And they kept building the pattern. By month 6, analysts noticed additional irregularities appearing across the processing system. Approval times had dropped dramatically. Claims that once required weeks of verification were now being approved within 48 hours. Some processed in under 12. Audit logs showed unexplained gaps. Verification checkpoints disappeared entirely. On paper, it appeared efficient. Modernized. Streamlined. But when analysts overlaid approval activity against financial routing behavior, the alignment became impossible to ignore. Every approval surge matched another spike in hidden transaction movement. Every increase in beneficiary activity matched another wave of fragmented financial transfers. That was when federal investigators reached a conclusion they could no longer dismiss. This network was not operating outside the system. It was operating inside it. Using legitimate infrastructure to conceal illegitimate flow. And that made it far more dangerous than anyone initially believed. Because systems designed to protect vulnerable citizens had quietly become tools for extraction. By month 9, the scale exploded. Federal analysts identified abnormal beneficiary growth across 11 states. Some regions showed increases exceeding 19% despite no measurable population growth. Other areas reported thousands of new beneficiaries appearing within a single fiscal cycle. The numbers made no sense. But the automated systems approved them anyway. Quietly. Efficiently. Without resistance. Investigators now estimate the hidden infrastructure redirected nearly $8.4 billion over multiple years. Funds originally intended for retirees, disabled citizens, and survivors dependent on federal assistance. Instead, massive portions of that money were quietly rerouted into hidden financial corridors operating beneath legitimate administrative systems. And the deeper analysts went, the worse the system became. Thousands of linked identity profiles appeared across interconnected databases. Duplicate addresses. Repeated biometric markers. Inactive identities suddenly reactivated. Payments continuing years after recorded death dates. The system was not malfunctioning. It was functioning exactly as someone intended. And someone inside was protecting it. Every approval surge matched another spike in hidden transaction movement. Every increase in beneficiary activity matched another wave of fragmented financial transfers. That was when federal investigators reached a conclusion they could no longer dismiss. This network was not operating outside the system. It was operating inside it. Using legitimate infrastructure to conceal illegitimate flow. And that made it far more dangerous than anyone initially believed. Because systems designed to protect vulnerable citizens had quietly become tools for extraction. By month 9, the scale exploded. Federal analysts identified abnormal beneficiary growth across 11 states. Some regions showed increases exceeding 19% despite no measurable population growth. Other areas reported thousands of new beneficiaries appearing within a single fiscal cycle. The numbers made no sense. But the automated systems approved them anyway. Quietly. Efficiently. Without resistance. Investigators now estimate the hidden infrastructure redirected nearly $8.4 billion over multiple years. Funds originally intended for retirees, disabled citizens, and survivors dependent on federal assistance. Instead, massive portions of that money were quietly rerouted into hidden financial corridors operating beneath legitimate administrative systems. And the deeper analysts went, the worse the system became. Thousands of linked identity profiles appeared across interconnected databases. Duplicate addresses. Repeated biometric markers. Inactive identities suddenly reactivated. Payments continuing years after recorded death dates. The system was not malfunctioning. It was functioning exactly as someone intended. And someone inside was protecting it. By month 11, federal surveillance intensified. Still no arrests. Still no public awareness. Investigators feared that even a single leak could collapse the operation before they identified the full structure behind it. Encrypted communications were monitored overnight. Internal network traffic was tracked continuously. Server behavior was analyzed during low-activity hours between midnight and dawn. That was when analysts discovered the hidden rhythm inside the system. The operation moved in cycles. Weekly routing windows. Monthly transfer surges. Quarterly identity resets. Everything automated with near-perfect timing. Then investigators found the core coordination hub. Buried inside a secured back-end processing complex outside Dallas, Texas. Officially, the facility handled administrative authorization support for regional processing systems. But internal activity logs told a completely different story. Server traffic peaked between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. every morning. Authorization credentials rotated continuously. Oversight logs disappeared during routing windows. Large volumes of encrypted traffic moved through isolated internal channels never intended for public administrative operations. That was when Federal Command approved intervention. Not as a routine arrest operation, but as a coordinated federal takedown. Because by now investigators understood something critical. The structure was layered. And removing one piece would not stop the system. At 4:37 a.m., movement began. No sirens. No media presence. No public warning. Just black federal vehicles moving silently through rain-covered streets outside the secured processing facility. Within minutes, tactical teams surrounded the complex. Power isolation units secured the perimeter. Cyber response teams prepared emergency containment protocols. Federal agents waited for final authorization. Then the command came through. Move. The breach happened fast. Reinforced glass doors shattered under steel entry tools. Agents flooded the main lobby. Hallways were secured immediately. Internal communications disabled. Network access isolated. Employees inside the facility were detained and separated before emergency deletion systems could activate. Inside the lower levels of the building, investigators found the real operation. Rows of server racks glowing blue in near darkness. Massive wall-sized displays showing live identity routing activity. Automated approval dashboards still processing transactions in real time during the raid itself. The system was still running. Federal cyber teams immediately began imaging the servers before shutdown protocols erased the infrastructure permanently. And what they found shocked investigators. Wall-sized databases containing thousands of linked identity profiles. Connected biometric authorization systems. Automated verification bypass structures. Approval chains designed specifically to move identities through the system without triggering review. But the financial infrastructure was even worse. Transaction routing software actively fragmented transfers into smaller amounts before redistributing them through shell contractors operating across multiple states. Then investigators uncovered another layer. The redirected funds were not simply disappearing. Portions were being routed into external criminal operations already under federal surveillance. Drug distribution corridors. Human trafficking networks. Money laundering systems tied to organized criminal enterprises operating across state lines. The government infrastructure itself had become part of a larger criminal financial ecosystem. And someone had spent years making sure nobody noticed. By 6:18 a.m., the operation expanded nationally. Federal warrants activated simultaneously across multiple states. Additional facilities were raided. Accounts frozen. Transfers halted. Digital routing systems disconnected. For the first time in years, the hidden infrastructure stopped moving. And then investigators made the discovery that changed the entire case. Inside one secured server cluster was a secondary access registry. Not transaction coordinators. Not financial operators. Protection layers. Individuals connected not to operating the system, but to shielding it from oversight. Internal compliance contacts. Authorization supervisors. Review managers. Personnel specifically positioned to prevent investigations from reaching the core infrastructure. The network had not survived because it was invisible. It survived because it was protected internally. By mid-morning, dozens of individuals were already in federal custody. Hundreds of linked financial accounts had been frozen. Millions in assets seized.